Hello, everyone, and welcome to Tales of Our Times. This is a show where we discuss the stories that move us, what makes them so meaningful, and why others could or should find meaning in them as well. This is not a spoiler-free show, so bear that in mind as you continue to listen. We tackle books, movies, comics, and more. Where there's a story, there's a reason to read. I'm your host, Amanda Stevens, and as you can probably tell, I'm feeling a little bit under the weather today. So in lieu of a regular episode, I would like to share with you a very special interview that I was honored to do with a man named Tobie Openshaw. Tobie is an affiliate researcher fellow and a documentary filmmaker who recently published a book, Seeking the Koko Ta'ay, investigating the origins of little people myths in Taiwan and beyond, where he collaborated with his own research and those of other researchers in Taiwan and around to look at some of the myths of the SaSiyat indigenous tribe here and their founding myths really about a group of mythical people called the Koko Ta'ay. I was able to sit in with my coworker Joey, and we discussed some topics ranging from what their place in folklore is, the ways in which we can embrace folklore, and the greater way that it ties into folklore around the world. What you're going to be hearing today is an excerpt of that interview. If you'd like to hear the entire interview, you can listen to it over at our internet-exclusive show, RTI Studios. But without further ado, let's get into it. So today we have a very special conversation with a documentary filmmaker and affiliate research fellow at the Center for Austronesian Studies in the University of Central Lancashire, Tobie Openshaw. Welcome back to RTI.
Hi, thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here.
Yeah, so I know you've done a couple of different interviews, but there's probably people out there who haven't heard you before, so could you please introduce yourself for them?
Sure. Yeah, I've been in Taiwan for 27 years now. A documentary filmmaker, and only just recently sort of moving into the academic realm a little bit. And my main interest really for the last 14 years or so has been Taiwan's indigenous people. And so I've been looking at past issues, pre-Neolithic issues, and including up to today's contemporary issues on that topic.
That's actually something that I would like to talk to you about today, and the research behind this mythical peoples that exists in some of Taiwan's indigenous folklore. I was wondering, would you mind telling the origin story of that myth for people who haven't heard it? Because I listened to the last time and I thought it was a really interesting story.
Right. No, it's absolutely fascinating. So the SaiSiyat people, one of the smallest groups in Taiwan, they're sort of in the northern Taiwan, have a foundational myth, a folklore, story, legend. We can talk more about what does that mean. But they tell the story that when they came up from the plains up into the mountains, there was a migration up into the mountains. Things were not going well for them. They did not know how to get by in the mountains. They were used to growing rice on the plains and things like that. And then they discovered a small group of little people. They describe them as short-statured, dark-skinned, with curly hair. And these people were very mischievous and playful and magical. But they helped the SaSiyat people. They showed them how to grow millet and dry rice in the mountains. They showed them how to hunt the boar, which plants are useful to eat for medicine, all of that kind of stuff. So for a long time, the relationship was very good between the SaSiyat and the Koko Ta'ay. However, because this was a declining population, partly, and also because of their mischievousness, that started to translate into them harassing the SaSiyat women. And then things started turning sour. And so after some time, this was becoming untenable, and a group of the SaSiyat men decided to do something about it. Now, the story goes that the Koko Ta'ay lived in a cave on the opposite side of the river, and so whenever there was a feast or a harvest festival or something, the SaSiyat would shoot an arrow across the river as a signal, and then the Ta'ay would come across the river and come and join their festival. And there was a tree sort of partially growing over the river that they used as a bridge, as they used to cross the river. And so that night, a group of the SaSiyat men went to cut partially through this tree, just halfway through it. And their idea was that after the party, when they'd all gone back home, they were going to cut the rest of the tree and then tell them, don't come back, we're done with you. But as so often happens in those times, lots of drinking and partying and people getting drunk and fights breaking out, and all the Ta'ay sort of left in a huff, and all of them got onto the tree at the same time, and the thing broke and it crashed down into the river, dashing them all to their deaths. Except for the shaman. Some versions of the story say 2 shaman who had stayed behind, and who, seeing their people wiped out like this, called down a curse on the SaSiyat people. And sure enough, bad things happened. Babies born with 2 heads, or just horrible things. And so the SaSiyat actually felt really bad about this, And so they tried to figure out how could they atone for this, how could they make up for this. And the shaman told them that if you go and learn the songs of the Ta'ay, there are 16 songs that the Ta'ay people used to sing throughout their day, where they're working or whatever, and it's all about the plants that they use and about your life and how to share what you have and the environment and all that kind of stuff. If you learn all those songs, then we can talk again. And so they went away and they learned the songs, and they came back after a year and they told the shaman, okay, we're going to present this to you now. And so the SaSiyat are divided into different clans, and there's one clan called the Jew clan, Jhu, and the boy from the Jew clan was able to accurately perform all 16 songs. And so the shaman said, okay, thank you, I accept your apology. However, you have to go back and teach all your people how to sing these songs, and every year you have to come together and perform this ritual and go through the whole cycle of songs, which takes 3 nights. And so they did. And since that time, the Jew clan are the leaders of the Ta'ay. They are the ones who control it and who manage it and who arrange everything. During the Japanese time, the Japanese tried to put a stop to this because they wanted to Japanify everybody, you know.
Especially the natives, I imagine.
Absolutely.
Didn't fit in with their vision of what they wanted Taiwan to be.
Right, and they wanted them civilized and pacified, there's that word, pacified.
Yeah.
And so a Japanese official came up to the mountain, interviewed people, talked to them about it, wrote down the myth, which was the first time it was ever written in written form. And he went back to his
manager
bosses,
or magistrate,
and said, these people believe that really bad things will happen to them if we put a stop to this. We should not do that. And to their credit, the Japanese agreed. And they did, however, make a negotiation, and it was made into every 2 years. So it's not every year. But so since that time then, every 2 years, they've done this ritual that runs over 3 days. There's lots of things happening before and after, but the main event is for 3 days. And I've been attending the Ta'ay now since 2012. So this year was my 6th.
Wow.
And it's just an amazing experience every time, because it's a group of people coming together saying sorry for something they say that happened in the past. And that's pretty unique.
It's very powerful. I always find it really interesting, like the ways in which like these kind of like foundational stories to people play out, and like trying to imagine like even what that negotiation must have been like between like in the colonial times, like how you even talk somebody into like, oh, just do it every other year. That will be fine. Like I can't imagine trying to have that conversation if you were,
in
really
this
penitent.
case, in this case, apparently it was largely logistical, because it takes a lot of effort, and it's several weeks that's basically taken out of your year. So I believe that it's also partly came from the SaSiyat saying, yeah, okay, fine, let's do it every 2 years. That's more manageable anyway.
Kind of thinking, at this point, maybe they've relaxed a little bit. Maybe they'll be okay if we just do it every 2 years.
So that's the thing. One part is a negotiation with the Japanese, but there must also have been a negotiation with the Koko Ta'ay.
Right. That's what I'm thinking is right. Especially when you're told like you're on thin ice. Like, you better do this every year. To another question. In a previous episode, I actually talked to some of my listeners about the differences between myths, legends, fairy tales, folklore, and kind of the way that those do and don't intertwine. Right? And so you and I have been using this word myth. I guess I was wondering, would you classify this story as a myth? You said it's a foundational myth, and the role in the daily lives and cultures of the SaSiyat people.
Right.
So.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question. It's a great question, but because I find that there's definitely gray areas between those terms.
Yeah.
And I'll start off by saying I'm not sure that it's all that useful to try to parse it so closely.
Yeah.
So, legends, we would say, is usually some stories about something that happened in the past, maybe some magical creatures, and there's usually a little moral lesson, that kind of thing. Myths usually involve heroes and stories like that. So the story of the Koko Ta'ay is a little bit somewhere in between that. But it certainly falls under folklore, being a more umbrella term of just the stories that we tell each other. But this has become such a central part of SaiSiyat identity and who they are and how they present themselves, that it's really a foundational myth.
Yeah.
However, again, we're coming at this from our Western perspective, and in my film, which I've just finished for Taiwan Plus, I give the last word to one of the elders after we have this whole film about all the research and the archaeology and everything we've done.
Yeah.
And his last words is, these anthropologists come here and they do all this kind of research and we don't care about that.
Yeah.
They say it's a myth. We say it's the truth. We believe in it. If you prove it, we'll just say, yeah, we told you. If you don't manage to prove it, that doesn't change anything about our belief, So I think that it's important to just understand that not everything, especially when it comes to dealing with indigenous people and indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge things, doesn't necessarily fit categories very clearly.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, to that point, something that I often bring up when I'm talking to people just about like all of these kind of stories in general is that while we can make clear lines, there really is no clear line between a lot of these things. So these categories that we have, a lot of times it kind of comes down to how much you or any individual really believes in it, right? And then that's going to be the difference. So it's really, I really like hearing this perspective as well, because I think it's a truth that some people have trouble wrestling with, I guess. You want to be able to put it in these clean categories, but a lot of times they just don't really fit perfectly into one box over the other.
And belief is also, is a big issue, of course. And we have religious belief, we have traditional beliefs and things like myth and legends. But many of, say, the modern SaiSiyat people don't necessarily believe that it happened exactly that way.
Of course.
Especially the magical part, but we can get to that later.
Yeah.
But so there's believing fervently, but there's also just acknowledging the belief. And that is equally important.
Yeah.
So they might not say, I believe this thing, but they say, my people believe this thing, and it becomes just part of their cultural identity.
Yeah, of course. And, that is also as valid as believing it yourself, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, who are we to try and draw a line between that?
Right.
So moving on to that belief, I guess, I kind of want to take that a little bit more globally, because one of the first things that struck me when I heard about your interview, when I heard you were discussing it, is that I had never heard of little people in Taiwan before. But where I had heard about little people was in a couple of other myths, across the globe. And they all have really similar characteristics. They're often diminutive. A lot of times they're very clever. They're mischievous. They often have access to magic. And these similarities are found across the world. So there's native peoples in America who have folklore. A lot of people are probably familiar with the idea in the form of leprechauns. So what do you think it is about the myth of little people that makes it so prevalent across cultures?
Right.
And how do you think that they all come to share similar characteristics?
No, that's a great question, and I can write another book just about that. So when you look at mythology a little bit wider, I have a chapter in my book which is about the little people myths across the Pacific, and the author Dean Karalekas, who's also my co-editor for the book, introduces the idea of a tale type. So in the 1930s, a paper was published about tale types and sort of classifying certain types of stories which are prevalent throughout. So, the Cinderella story is C415, and that means that it's a young girl who is being mistreated by someone who's not a member of her family, a stepmother, and then escapes with some magical help, possibly from animals, and then has her comeuppance, So that's a very common story. And for some reason, in our human storytelling tradition, going back to the days when we sat around the fire and told stories about hunts and things like that, that has become very prevalent. Stories about little people go way back. The Egyptians have stories about little people. In Greece, in the Greeks, there are pre-Homer fragments that talk about little people. If you ask why, I mean, that's, lost in the mist of time. But I think if you look at things like the, pixies and leprechauns and things like that in European folk tales, and then also coming back to stories like in the Pacific, like Hawaii, talk about the Menehune, and in the Solomon Islands talk about the Kokomora. Those are always people who were there before us, and as you say, small and mischievous and tricksy, but magical. So they can either help you or they can hinder you, So they can be used by parents to tell children to not be naughty, things like that. But the reason for them being small and diminutive, I feel, has to do with maintaining their outsider status. We know for how many decades, hundreds of years, we looked at people with dwarfism as freaks, as funny, but funny, scary, that kind of. So that's the way they were presented in circuses and things like that, and always othered. And so I think that if you developed a story about normal-sized human beings who lived in a place before you, you would have a higher level of responsibility towards acknowledging them and making a space for them and recognizing their rights to the land, things like that. Whereas with little people living in holes, we can sort of leave them in their holes and not be too concerned about that part, So that's really just my thumbsuck on that level.
Getting back to Taiwan, after this conversation, I'm sure that there will also be listeners who are interested in learning more about indigenous peoples, and especially like if they're from my side, they might be interested in learning about the stories or mythology. Do you know of any resources like authors or places that people could go either in Taiwan or for listeners who are not in Taiwan? Where would be a good place to start looking for more information on those cultures and on those stories?
Well, when you find out, let me know, okay?
Yeah.
No, it's really, really difficult to do this research because little has been written, and what has been written is always in very sort of obscure places. Since I finished this book, my partner, who is very interested in the topic, has been starting to dig, and she has come up with Mandarin sources that I never knew existed, things that are very complete and very broad, and I'm like, why didn't I have this before? So I'm afraid most of the useful resources are in Mandarin. In English, well, firstly, you can buy my book.
Where could people buy that also?
So it's published by Brill, the academic publisher in Europe, Brill. And so if you go to the Brill website and you type in Koko Ta'ay, just Koko Ta'ay, it'll come up. And unfortunately, it is priced not by my decision. It's academic pricing, so it's like 5,000 NT for a copy, which I think is ridiculous. But that's unfortunately what we had to do to get it published. But otherwise, if you look in children's libraries, you actually find quite a few books that have Taiwan folklore stories, often with Mandarin and English. So unfortunately, I don't have any easy, just go here and here. It's going to take a little bit of digging.
Of course. I think a good focus for a lot of people, too, is being open and looking for these stories and appreciating them where you find them, and giving people from these communities, from the SaSiyat, from all these other indigenous communities, places where they can share those stories, To your point, for anyone who's out there, do investigate those children's stories. We've talked about them before, but just because it's written for children doesn't mean you won't find anything valuable in there. And a lot of times it's written in a way that is entertaining as well.
Absolutely.
And unfortunately, that's all the time that we have today. A special thanks to Tobie for appearing on our show. Again, you can listen to the interview in full on our internet-exclusive show, RTI Studios, if you want to hear a little bit more about how my coworker Joby goes into the socioeconomic side of what it's like to interview with a local indigenous tribe and how you preserve their folklore and even how you go about asking or getting involved in these kind of things, and discuss a little bit more in detail about what can be found in his book. You can find his book, Seeking the Koko Ta'ay, investigating the origins of little people myths in Taiwan and beyond by searching for it on the internet. As he said, it is priced as an academic study book, but if it's something you're interested in, I think it's definitely worth checking out. To all of you listeners out there, we'll be back with a regular episode next week. But until then, we'll see you next time.